Morning, everybody. Welcome. We're learning today's Torah Parsha. Today's Torah study is the portion of Parshas Bo, and we're learning how to break free from Egypt. What does it take to free yourself from your imprisonment? Now, it's difficult for us to think of ourselves in a state of imprisonment on a physical plane, but when you realize that you live in a state of spiritual imprisonment or emotional imprisonment, you realize that Egypt and the Exodus becomes a far more of a personal story than merely on a one-dimensional escape. This is a three-dimensional escape in the sense that there are the imprisonment of our own soul. There is the slavery of our own convictions and persuasions. Pharaoh represents our ego. And slavery in Egypt means the slavery to our habits, to our tendencies, and to our prejudices and preconceptions. Addictions. We said addictions? Yeah. So all sorts of addictions. There's all sorts of addictions that we have. And the question is, how do we free ourselves from them? Let's analyze today's Torah portion to be able to understand what it was, what it took for the Jewish people to break free from Egypt, and see if we might be able to draw a parallel to our own lives as well. So if you go to today's Torah portion, I'm going to move forward to the page 379.
But before you do that,
Yeah.
You've explained this once before, but I've forgotten. At the very beginning, it says, God said to Moses, come to Pharaoh.
Come to Pharaoh.
Why didn't it say go to Pharaoh?
So that's a very deep analysis. The question is, why does the name of the Torah portion come and not go? Why is the name of the portion come and not go? Which means Hashem says to Moses, come to Pharaoh. Why does he not say go to Pharaoh? Go would imply to go out of your comfort zone, to go out of your realm of holiness to Pharaoh. Come to Pharaoh would imply that Moses is rising above his own holiness level to a higher level of holiness. That's come, like go near. It really sounds like Pharaoh is some sort of a positive experience. The word come is a positive word. Go is more of a harsh negative word. And Chassidus explains that Pharaoh actually represents the key to your healing. That when you have the courage to face your fears, instead of running away from them, that is what holds the key to your purpose and your mission.
Makes it internal
upon this earth. Okay, so that's a very insightful discussion over there. Okay, where were we? We were talking about the 379, where Hashem commands the Jewish people to take for themselves a lamb and to tie it to their bed. So let's take a look at that. Where were we? 379.
No, number 3.
bottom.
That's
Yeah,
the
12,
3.
3.
I'm sorry. No, 379 is the beginning of the
Take
portion.
himself a lamb or kid for
Oh, here it is.
his
Very good. Okay. So bottom of page 379. Speak together to the entire community of Israel today on the first month, saying, on the 10th of this month, each man among them who heads an extended family unit must take for himself a lamb, a kid for his extended family, unless the extended family is so big that not everyone will be able to eat a kazayit, which is the size of an olive of the lamb or kid. In such a case, they should take a lamb or kid for each nuclear family. We continue in 381. On the other hand, if the nuclear family is too small to require a lamb or kid, then the family head and a neighbor who lives near his home must take one together according to the number of people, for it is forbidden to leave any of the meat of the offering uneaten or sunburned until morning. If after forming a group to eat a specific lamb or kid together, someone wants to leave this group and join another, he may do so only before the animal is slaughtered. So basically, you've got to form groups that will ensure that every last morsel of flesh of this lamb or kid will be eaten on the night of Passover. You must be counted for the lamb or kid according to what each individual eats. That's the sick or elderly who cannot eat a kazayit, which is the size of an olive, are not counted. You must use a flawless young male animal in the first year of its offering. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. That's a lamb or a kid. You must watch over it until the 14th day of this month. i.e. for a minimum of 4 days. The obligation to make sure it is not blemished does apply to all future Passover offerings. It is only the obligation to designate a specific lamb or kid as the Passover offering on the 10th. That applies this time only. The entire assembly community of Israel must then slaughter their sacrifices on the afternoon of the 14th in 3 shifts, although only one person will slaughter each lamb or kid on behalf of the group. Since a person's designated substitute is his legal proxy, it will be as if they all slaughtered it. So basically, one person is slaughtering the lamb on behalf of the entire group of people that are going to be eating it. Last piece, when slaughtering the lamb or kid, they must collect the blood in a basin. They must take some of the blood that has been collected this way and place it on the 2 doorposts and on the lintel inside the houses in which they will eat the sacrifice. They do not need to place any blood on structures not used for dwelling. Now, Rashi points out to us about this 4-day business. Here. I'm looking up the Rashi 1 second. Okay, I can't find it right now. I think this red eye got me a little out of the whack. But the point is like this: is that the commentators explain to us that the purpose of this 4-day break is in order to make sure that the Jewish people will be holding on to the lamb or kid for 4 days. They would actually tie it to their beds. They would tie the animal to their beds for 4 days before slaughtering it. Let's talk about the timeline of the Exodus from Egypt, okay? Moses meets God at the burning bush a year prior to the story. He goes to Pharaoh after negotiating with God for 7 days. Takes him 3 months till he approaches Pharaoh. Moses was very reluctant. Then he begins with the first plague. Each plague takes 1 month. 1 week of warning, 1 week of actual plague, and like 2 weeks of recovery. So each plague takes about a month. The last 2 plagues, I think, were at the same time, were in the same month. So long story short, this is now 1 year after the burning bush, and Moses tells the Jewish people, "Okay, we're getting ready to leave Egypt. You're going to need to slaughter a pascal lamb. On the 10th day of the month of Nisan, I want you to tie this lamb next to your beds. Hold it there for 4 days. On the 4th day, which is the 14th of Nisan, we're going to slaughter this lamb. That night, I want you to stay in your homes. No Jews allowed to leave their home. That's when we paint the blood in the doorpost. And God passes over the homes. What happens that night when God passes over the homes? That's the death of the firstborn. And the very next morning, or that night really, Pharaoh begs the Jews and forces the Jews to leave Egypt. Right? 7 days after that, they come to the Red Sea, which is why the night of the passing over is the night of the Seder. That's the 15th of Nisan. Remember, the 14th of Nisan is when they slaughtered the lamb and they painted the doorpost. So that night, which is the 15th of Nisan, is when we celebrate the Seder. 7 days later, we do the 7th day of Pesach, which commemorates the crossing of the Red Sea. Right?
How many Jews were reluctant in leaving Egypt, though?
Were reluctant?
Yeah.
Reluctant?
Some didn't want to leave. Did they not?
So 80% of the Jews, that's next week's Torah portion, it says that only 20% of the Jews actually left Egypt. Chamushim. It's Rashi says that 20% of the Jews left Egypt, which means 80% of the Jews did not leave Egypt. Why? Because they didn't believe in Moses. And that ties in perfectly to what I'm about to tell you. What's the significance of tying this lamb to their beds or the kid to their beds for 4 days? That's right. That's right. Let's talk about that. The Egyptians worshipped the lamb. This is their god. Remember, they were people who worshipped not one god. You know what lambs and sheep represented? Money. You measured your wealth based upon how many cattle you had. So this was currency. This is money. Can you even relate to people like this? This is the culture we live in.
Yeah, of course.
This is our culture. Right? How many people do you know that worship money? Like everyone I know, almost, right? I mean, think about it. We live in a culture that worships money. Do you know people? So the Egyptians, you know, we talk about them as pagans, that they worship the weather, the sun, the moon, the stars. They worshipped the most powerful human being, which sounds ridiculous. They worship Pharaoh, right? But do we worship a powerful human being? I think we do.
Sure.
There are powerful people that we worship. I mean, I hate to say that word, but think about the great gods of American cultures. Taylor Swift, and I mean, it's pathetic. It's just pathetic. But what would people not do to see Taylor Swift, right, or whatever, one of these other characters, right, or the other great thinkers of American culture, like Kanye West, the great thinkers of modern. Kanye said it. How many people worship the New York Times? It says it was printed in the New York Times. It's got to be true, right? I mean, think about it. Anderson Cooper or Shepard Smith, or if you're on the big screen, then you've got to be something really, really special, right? No, but in our culture that we live in, we actually attribute great value and strength to people that are larger than life. The President of the United States, Donald Trump, right? People like Donald Trump couldn't do anything wrong, right? American Idol, Winston says. Thank you very much, American Idol. Yeah, they actually call it American Idol. But people like Obama. There was Obama. He couldn't do anything wrong. Didn't matter what he was doing. Whatever he was doing was fine. Was good. This is a culture. This is Egypt. We're living in that same culture, where we are.
Who speaks with a British accent?
Everybody speaks with a British accent. Sounds intelligent, right? Doesn't matter what he's saying. Yeah. So it's just very interesting for us to realize.
I think Yiddish and speak British. That's what they said.
What?
I think Yiddish and speak British.
So what I'm trying to say, guys, is that we're living in a culture which actually, like the ancient Egyptians, does not believe in one God. Imagine we lived in a culture that did believe in one God. Then we wouldn't be intimidated by the news. We wouldn't be intimidated by the United Nations or some other entities. We actually attribute strength to these organizations. In order to break free from that kind of a culture, it's not easy. And that's why 80% of the Jews stay behind. They couldn't. They could not set themselves free from such a mentality where they worship their cars. Their country clubs, which they wear on their sleeve. This is who I am. It's my identity, right? And if you have a choice between, being invited to some country club dinner or going to shul, it's not an easy decision.
Hey, but what did those the Jews who stayed behind? They weren't worshiping the country club. They were in slavery. They made a decision. They'd rather be slaves than be dead.
I want to tell you something. My aunt from Milan. I spent a long time verbringing with her this past Shabbos, and she believes that the Jewish people were not building bricks in Egypt. They were not building towers. They were not building bricks and stones in Egypt. Her understanding of the verse, and she argues passionately that this is her interpretation of the Rebbe's understanding. It's my aunt from Italy. She's not making this up. I mean, she really interprets the story of the Chumash through the eyes of the Rebbe's teachings. She says that slavery in Egypt means what we're going through right now. How many people are slaves to their cell phones? How many people want to be talking to their children, but they cannot overcome the urge to check their cell phone every 15 seconds? How many people do you know like that? Almost everybody I know. It is absolutely overwhelming. You get onto an airplane and you see every mind go, switch off as soon as that TV screen goes on. And there's no creative thinking. There's very little creative writing, creative reading, very little of that, because we just slaves to whatever's on the screen, right? So Tanta Rivki's interpretation, Rivki Chazan is her name. Her interpretation is that the slavery in Egypt was a slavery of an addiction. She interprets not the slavery as in they're being whipped.
No, it's a mindset.
It was an addiction. Yeah, an addiction. But an addiction to power, an addiction to prestige, an addiction to affluence, to influence, an addiction to identity enhancers, to status quo. right, and so on and so forth. But to be able to believe in one God is such a profound dive beyond the superficial. It's such a leap of faith to be able to say that I'm not intimidated by all of that. That's what it took to break out of Egypt. So now we can understand why 80% of the Jews stay behind, right? But let's talk a little bit
What
about...
happened to those 2.4 million Jews that stayed behind?
Okay, so this is a debate that you and I had many moons ago. What happened to the Jews that stayed behind? You once complained to me about Moses that he hit the rock, right? And I told you that I don't think that Moses was weak when he hit the rock. I think he was very, very, very powerful when he hit the rock because he deliberately hit the rock. This man who made no mistake. He followed the word of God like a chariot. Suddenly now, in his at the age of 120, now suddenly hits the rock. He doesn't listen. He deliberately hit the rock because he did not want to enter the promised land, because Moses understood that if he was to enter the promised land, Mashiach would come. And the souls of the Jews that died in Egypt and in the desert would have no redemption. He therefore threw himself under the bus, hit the rock, denied access to the promised land. Mashiach was delayed in order to allow the souls of those Jews who died in Egypt, the non-believers, and the souls of those Jews who died in the desert to be able to return, to reincarnate, and have another chance at redemption. Who are the souls of the Jews that died in the desert? Not the ones that died in Egypt. Who are the Jews that died in the desert? The Arizal says that those Jews that died in the desert were reincarnated, and they will be the Jews alive to welcome Mashiach. The generation that will, the generation that will greet the Mashiach is the Jews that died in the desert.
Even though it'll be millions of us, and those were several 100,000. So
I'm not going to get into the mathematics over here. The souls could be different kind of reincarnations, sparks of the whatever. Without getting into that, my point is that our generation is the generation about whom the Rebbe said Mashiach is coming in our lifetimes. Okay, whatever that means. Mashiach, we are the generation that will welcome Mashiach, which means we are the generation that died in the desert, that didn't believe in the promised land. Therefore, us more than anybody else, we're the ones that need to figure out a way to break out of Egypt.
So we're reliving the mindset.
Exactly. But we've got to break it out. We've got to read today's Torah portion. Instead of reading it in an ancient story, read it as your story. Read it as your mistake that you made 3,000 years ago. And how am I going to fix it this time around? Because this is my last rodeo.
Rabbi, was there a leader amongst the Jews that stayed behind?
I don't think so. I don't think so. Now, what was it? I'd like to focus on one thing. Between now and Pesach, I'd like you to think about it, what it was that got the Jews out of Egypt and how we can replicate that. But one thing I'd like to bring to your attention is the tying of the lamb to the bed for 4 days. What is it about tying the bed to the lamb to the bed? It was a physical manifestation of faith. Physical manifestation of faith. Because by tying the lamb to their beds, the Egyptians would ask them, why are you tying our God to your bed? Like, why are you tying money to your bed? Right? Gods of prestige and influence. So they said, because we're slaughtering your God to our God. Now, on a one-dimensional level, that sounds a little crude to say we're going to kill your God for our God. But on a more psychological, personal level, what that means is that I refuse to be influenced by my superficial perception of reality, and I choose to see what lies beneath the surface, to identify the one God that is behind every detail of my life. How did they do that? By putting the lamb in front of their faces for 4 days. My interpretation of what this meant was that it's easy to get the Jews out of Egypt. That takes an instant. But to get the Egypt out of the Jews, that takes something else. That takes visual. It takes a visual, which means it's not enough to hear a great sermon and then check out. You've got to physically experience it. So I notice when people come to shul and they learn Torah on a regular basis, it's the consistency of the Torah that molds their mindset, neuroplasticity, that helps them develop new neural pathways and new ways of thinking to counter neural pathways that they've worked with for 50 years of their life. Let me just finish this point. So in much the idea of tying this lamb to their beds for 4 days, and and telling themselves, most importantly, more important than telling anybody else, was telling themselves that I believe in one God who is behind even the God of money. It's being able to tell that to themselves. So when we can meditate our way through Torah study, when we can consistently act on a mitzvah, it doesn't matter how much money you give to charity. The main thing is that you give it consistently. It might not be that important how long you daven, but the main thing is to be doing it consistently. When you observe Shabbat, look, even once is amazing. But if you can keep it consistently, I think it's the consistency is the key of the 4-day break. Because, even when Abraham was asked to slaughter his son to bind his son upon the altar, it says that God made him travel for 3 days to get there. 3-day journey. Why a 3-day journey? So nobody should say that he did it that he did it in haste, without having time to process it. The idea of 3 days is giving you enough time to think something through, right? So by tying the lamb to the beds for 4 days, they had a solid 72-hour period over there with which they could really think this through. And I guess what this means to say is that 72 hours is a transformational experience. 72 hours of Torah, 72 hours of 3 days of commitment is what it's going to take. You were going to say something, Keith?
So it was just about tying the lamb. It's like tying your addiction to what you're worshiping in front of you, and just tying it down so you can get past it.
Tying it down.
In other words, you're putting it in front of you. You're thinking about, do I really need that? Do I really need that? Materialism. There's more past that.
It's interesting.
Facing your addiction.
Yeah. You're tying it there. You're examining it.
You're putting it right by your bed.
Yeah.
You're running away from your problem. So you're saying perhaps the way to get away from your addiction is by facing it. That's very interesting.
As you were talking about that, that's the image I had in my mind.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Something to think about.
Iconography.
Like coming to your Pharaoh, right? Coming to your Pharaoh. I heard an amazing story on Shabbos. I'm going to share with you. I'm going to wrap it up with this. The Rebbe was walking down the street in either Paris or France, somewhere during the beginning of the war. And the Rebbe was walking with his wife, and they see some Nazi soldiers walking towards him. So the Rebbe's wife, the Rebbetzin, said, "We should go another way." And the Rebbe's response was amazing. I was thinking about all Shabbos. The Rebbe's response was amazing. The Rebbe said, "I don't even see them." Takes the idea of see no evil to a whole new level. To the Rebbe, he sees just one God. Any enemy, any anti-Semite, any source of fear is simply non-existent. And the Rebbe proceeded to walk with Rebbetzin, walking right past them, no problem. So I was in San Diego yesterday. I was walking down the pier by the submarine, and as it happens, I was walking with my wife, and as we were walking past the docks, a group of 4 young Arabs looked at me, and they said, I saw them, but I was thinking of the story. I was like, so they saw me. So one of them, in a very respectful way, said, "Let me ask you a question." I said, "Yeah." No fear. "Is this thing for Judaism?" I said, "Yeah." And I smiled fearlessly and kept on going. It's very interesting to apply this concept that you're not afraid of your addiction. You're not afraid of, you see, when you're worshiping an idol, you fear the idol. You fear that thing is power over you. But to be able to disarm your idol would be to attribute no power to it. Tie it down. You're my slave, and I'm not your slave, right? And to take this approach that says, I believe in one God, and I'm going to break out Egypt out of me, right? And I think that's what's going on in this beautiful story about the 4 days, something for us to really, really think about. And I want to just say that in the verse it says, as the days of your exodus from Egypt, so too will I show you miracles in the future, which means that just in the same way that we broke out of Egypt, so too we will break out of the future redemption. And therefore, the lessons of how we broke out of the original Egypt is what we have to apply as well to breaking out of this current exile as well. Comment coming in: 40-year walk from Egypt to Canaan. That's a long walk. I could walk from South Africa to Europe in less than 40 years of my lifetime. That's, sir, if you had directions. But the Jewish people didn't have directions, and it was part of the journey. All right, guys, I'm going to wrap it up over here. Thank you for joining me here this morning. Any comments?
I'm just